I'm going to talk about toxocarosis and its zoonotic risk and management. Now, and this is a condition that many of us will be familiar with, but a very, very significant zoonotic risk, even today. Just to have a little review, Toxocara canis and Toxocara cati. These are intestinal nematodes of dogs and cats, as I'm sure we're all aware, but far and away the most common nematode seen and treated in small animal practice. It's ubiquitous, essentially. The vast majority of pets we see will have been exposed to it or will have it. And certainly in terms of publicity, although it hasn't had anywhere near the PR drive that other worms such as lungworm have had recently, there is a background awareness of its zoonotic potential. And people will come into practices and will be worried about that and will ask vets, nurses, reception staff about it, because quite often people are much more comfortable about asking vets about this public health risk, especially if there's a veterinary angle, than perhaps their GP. Its life cycle, again, hopefully we're all aware with, but I'll just briefly recap. It's unembryonated eggs that are passed in the faeces, and these take 2 to 7 weeks to reach the infective L3 stage, so this little worm within the egg. We used to think it was the L2, I mean that's a technicality really, it's not going to affect us on a day-to-day basis, but it's actually the L3 in that egg. But what this means is that fresh faeces are not a zoonotic risk. So, you know, people will be worried, say, and rightly so, if their children or if themselves fall into fresh faeces or get it on their hands or bodies. And I mean, there are certainly pathogens that you can get from fresh faeces, but not toxocarosis. The problem with the faeces is that they will contribute to environmental contamination and then will develop into these infective stages. Certainly for dogs, consumption of these eggs is a relatively minor route. The vast majority of dogs are infected at birth. They cross the placenta, and certainly if they're not infected at that point, then they'll be infected by the transmammary route shortly after birth. In cats, there's no transplacental infection, but the transmammary route is still there, so infection still very rapidly gets close to 100% in kittens. Adult cats will also get infected by paratenic host ingestion, and I mean this is another very important route in cats. They'll go out, they'll hunt birds, they'll hunt rats, mice, small furry creatures, and they'll get infected that way. What happens is you have puppies and kittens where you have this tremendously high prevalence and rates of infection. But then what happens is you have a natural immunity that kicks in at round about 6 months. And this means that the adult prevalence is much lower. Now, when we talk about the adult prevalence, lots of these stages hide away in tissues when the immunity kicks in. So the parasite is still there, but it will periodically reactivate through the pet's life, or adult dogs and cats will get reinfected. And this leads to a patent adult prevalence of frequently less than 5%, around about 4 or 5% in dogs, and frequently less than 20% in cats. Much more variable in cats. You can get domestic cat populations where it's down around 5%, particularly if they're not going out much. You get hunting cat populations, it's going up to maybe 10, 20%. In semi-feral, feral populations, it can actually be much, much higher. Zoonotic potential, the real tragedy of toxocarosis is that it's young children that are at the highest risk, 2 to 4 year olds, but adults can also be affected. We're not sure with the children whether this is an immunity-based thing, whether humans as well get immunity as they get older. it's much more likely to be a lifestyle thing. Certainly if my own children are anything to go by, young children spend a lot of time sticking their hands in their mouth. Their hygiene isn't going to be as good as adults. And that creates a problem in itself. This leads to a number of syndromes. Visceral larval migrans is when these larvae are migrating through the liver and migrating to the lungs. This doesn't lead to patent infection in people, but potentially these larvae can create a lot of immune reaction and a lot of inflammatory damage. And that can lead to liver problems, lung complications, increasing evidence of links to asthma, but also to lethargy, failure to thrive, flu-like symptoms. Perhaps the one that we're most familiar with is ocular larval migrans. Now, this is awful. It's where the larvae gets into the back of the eye, and it can affect vision directly. Back in the day, they were sometimes mistaken for tumours. Diagnostic rates are much, much better now, but still you're looking at significant eye pathology. Other forms are now recognised. So there are neurological forms. The larvae can get into the central nervous system, and this can lead to neurological defects. Most significantly, in recent years, there was a very good meta-analysis done in 2012 which showed a very strong evidence of a link to epilepsy. And that is to say that it's a risk factor for epilepsy. So if you've been exposed to Toxocara, then your risk of developing epilepsy goes up. And there's also covert forms. Now, the covert forms, it's one of these situations where seroprevalence is actually reasonably high. So you've got a lot of people who've been exposed to the parasite and then feel a little bit unwell. So, they get flu-like symptoms, they perhaps feel lethargic, they've got fatigue-type syndromes. What you don't know is whether those signs are coincidental or whether they're linked to infection with the parasite. This is extremely difficult to pick apart, especially if you're a man like me. You get man flu, who knows whether you've got toxocarosis or just man flu. So how do people get infected? Well, the vast majority of infections are by ingestion of embryonated eggs, and T. canis and T. cati, that is conclusive now that both parasites are very much involved. And I think we're realising day by day that the role of T. cati has probably been vastly underestimated. There are other ways to get infected. You can get infected by eating parotenic hosts yourself, so eating undercooked game has certainly been proposed as a possible infection route. There aren't many people getting infected this way. I think if you're generously given a nice wild shot duck, I would cook it well for many reasons, but this doesn't pose a significantly high risk. The most significant route is embryonated egg ingestion. So how are we exposed to those eggs? Well, certainly a main route is geophagia. So you've got consumption of eggs from the soil. Now, this can happen accidentally. Certainly my kids are out in the soil, and certainly if faeces are allowed from contaminated pets to build up, say in gardens, you've got a very focal point there. Or say if cats are using sandpits as litter trays, then you've got another focal point. It can happen through cultural habit. There are cultures where soil is eaten deliberately, and also much more commonly children will eat it deliberately because at certain ages they seem to like it, a bit of soil consumption. So lots of ways that embryonated eggs can be eaten through the soil. They can also be transferred onto other objects. So because they're sticky, you can get mechanical transmission onto garden toys, onto objects that have been lying in the garden for a long time, or for that matter in the household. And then children especially love to suck these objects and put them in their mouths. So there's potential for infection that way. Also, we've found out the potential for direct dog contact. So there is some potential for eggs to get stuck to the coats of dogs or develop in the coat of dogs. So you've got direct contact that way. All of these routes have led to a seroprevalence of between 2 and 31% across Europe, depending on the country that you study. And certainly in the UK, we're looking at between 2 and 3% seroprevalence, which is on the lower end, but we're still looking at around about 1 in 50 people who've been significantly exposed to Toxocara. Just to talk a little bit about direct dog contact, there have been studies done in the UK, in Holland, Turkey, Republic of Ireland, which have all found embryonated eggs in the coat of dogs. Now, there's been a lot of argument about whether those have been mechanically placed there because of their stickiness from dogs rolling around in the soil in the environment, or whether they can actually embryonate. Now, Keegan and Holland in 2013 demonstrated that eggs can indeed embryonate in biologically significant numbers in dog hair. It's not anywhere near the embryonation rate of soil. I think these things need to be kept in perspective, but I do think we need to consider dog hair as a potential direct route of contamination. Having said all of this, it does need to be kept in perspective. The incidence of clinical disease is relatively low. It's around about 2 cases per year per million people in the UK. Having said that, I think any case of toxocarosis is a tragedy and potentially preventable. And certainly disease is going to be underreported. There's only voluntary reporting to the Health Protection Agency, the HPA, and a lot of covert cases, as I've discussed, are very, very difficult to diagnose. And certainly a combination of the number of these cases and fear has led to UK legislation being affected by public concern and the incidence of disease. So what are the risk factors? What are the chances of you being one of these 1 in 50 people? Well, straight away, the risk of toxocarosis increases threefold if you have a dog in your house. And lots of us, myself included, have a dog in our house. So immediately that's a threefold increase in risk. It increases 5-fold if you've had a litter of puppies in the house ever at all. It doesn't have to be currently, but just if you've ever had puppies in the house. The risk increases as the number of dogs increases. I should say not exponentially. If you have 50 dogs, you're not guaranteed to be infected, but it does start to creep up if you have a lot of dogs in the house. And also, puppies, kittens, as I've discussed, are very high risk, and hunting adult cats and dogs. I should say this is all in animals that haven't been dewormed, where these risks are occurring. So how do we control it? How do we go about controlling it? Well, controlling it is a 3-step process. We need to regularly deworm pets. We need to get dog faeces picked up, and we need very good hygiene around pets. So I'm going to talk a little bit about worming frequency. Now, there's a lot of debate about sort of how often we should deworm our dogs and how we should go about it. And the sort of standard advice is that you should do it every 3 months. As far as I'm still aware, that's BSAVA advice, and it is a reasonable interval to go for. It certainly will control intestinal disease from parasites like hookworm and whipworm, and will help to limit any pathology from toxocarosis in dogs and kittens, although you need very high burdens to create pathological signs in cats and dogs. But the linchpin is that there have been a couple of studies, including Ride and Wolf in 2007, which have demonstrated that worming at 3 monthly intervals reduces egg output. And that's very important. We know that there's science that shows that if you're doing it every 3 months, egg output goes down. And if egg output goes down, we get a reduction in risk. There is absolutely no evidence that worming every 6 months makes any difference to egg output. In fact, those studies showed that it made no difference. So at the moment, for people recommending twice a year, there's really no evidence to back that up, and certainly less frequently than that, there's nothing at all. So I would say, given that there's zoonotic risk, and given that infection is ubiquitous and shedding is intermittent, that worming, deworming 4 times a year should be a minimum recommendation. We know that monthly deworming will block Toxocara overproduction, certainly by over 90%. So higher risk groups, this is what you'd be moving up to. And certainly we know that puppies and kittens are very, very high risk groups. So in terms of reducing pathology for them, you'd worm every 2 weeks until 2 weeks post-weaning. And then to prevent this egg production, you'd be giving a wormer every month up until 6 months of age. So what sort of worming frequency for adult cats and dogs? Well, Toxocara being ubiquitous is predominant UK intestinal nematode in cats and dogs, aside from its zoonotic risk. So worming every 3 months with an anthelmintic effective against Toxocara should be a minimum recommendation. We are very lucky, given its zoonotic potential and how common it is, that patent Toxocara infection is very, very easy to kill. You have to work quite hard to find products that won't do it. Some people still manage. They'll go down the pet shop and find a piperazine product or nitroscanate, which is effective, just very difficult to give correctly. But all of the products that you're likely to be stocking on your shelves in veterinary practices are going to be effective against Toxocara. In terms of adult dogs, moving up to monthly deworming should be considered for any household with children in, because they are such a high risk group, and equally so immune suppressed individuals. So say people are on chemotherapy, HIV patients, anywhere where there's immune suppression, then monthly deworming should be considered. And also we need to consider whether there are hunting dogs and cats, and the number of cats and dogs, whether it's a breeding establishment in the household. Any of those factors are justification to go up to monthly deworming. Picking up of dog faeces, though, is equally important. And the reason it's important is when you're talking to clients about the risk of toxocarosis, they can only do so much themselves. They can look after their own pets, they can pick up dog faeces in their own garden, and even if everybody was doing as we ask, there would be some egg production. So picking up of dog faeces and promoting that to reduce infection across the whole country is vitally important. And to be fair to councils across the country, they are working very, very hard on this. So you'd struggle to get very far without finding a council poster. Some go for fines, they decide to go down that route, well, most do, but also to raise awareness of the zoonotic risk of Toxocara. And this is being done more and more. And if councils are trying to raise awareness of Toxocara in this way, that is only going to bring more queries into veterinary practice. Increased ease of disposal is very important. So in veterinary practices, most of us offer free poo bags, which is very good for use in and around the practice. But also councils increasingly are using combined litter bins, which is a very simple step, but just a fantastic measure. So this is an example outside where I work, and it is very clearly marked. It's a litter bin, but dog waste is accepted. It's saying, look, please just drop it in here, and there's probably one every 50 metres. So they're making it very, very easy for the populace to dispose of these faeces. Banning of dogs from sports fields and play areas seems harsh, but it does keep faeces out of these areas, and that's good for all sorts of hygienic reasons. particularly sports fields. If we consider rugby or football, where people are spending a lot of their time on their backside, on the field, even if you're picking up dog poo, probably round about 2 to 10% of it is left behind. So, I think it's sensible to keep dogs, and as far as we can, cats and foxes from these areas. Covering of sandpits is increasingly being recognised as very important as well, and also, as far as we can, trying to keep cats out of allotment areas because they are proving to be a significant source of transmission, and they love to bury their faeces in places where potentially children will play, or potentially where fruit and vegetables will be harvested. And it should be said that if you have cats visiting your allotment, it's very important to also wash fruit and vegetables as well before eating them. And hygiene is very, very important. So as well as washing the fruit and vegetables, regular hand washing is vital in reducing transmission. It's one of these situations where we need to educate the public, but we don't want to frighten them. We want to explain that there are very simple solutions. And you worm your dog very regularly, certainly monthly, you're going to massively reduce risk within your household. Outside of the household, transmission is somewhat out of your control. But if you're regularly washing your hands, you're going to massively reduce risk. There's been a lot of question about whether washing dogs makes any difference. I think in clean dogs, that's probably, if I say clean, when there's no obvious external contamination, it's probably not going to make much difference. But if your dog is absolutely covered in soil or faeces, its own, or many dogs love to have a good roll in faeces from various species, then washing is intuitive, but also very, very sensible. And of course, increased education. So I think because Toxocarosis is a zoonosis, we're all very frightened to sort of scare off clients, to make them reluctant to have a close bond with their pets. But I think it is important to promote knowledge that this zoonosis is out there, but also that it is very, very preventable. So in summary, we live with this zoonosis. There are cases in the UK every year, and it is a potentially completely preventable and debilitating disease. And responsibility for reducing it ultimately lies, to a certain extent, with owners and the public, but only if they are responsibly educated by councils and the veterinary profession. And we should continue to promote regular deworming. We shouldn't be afraid of that. We should give a good recommendation, and that in the vast majority of cases, a minimum of 4 times a year, but also to promote good hygiene and disposal of faeces. Thank you for listening.